Monogamy is actually in crisis. How does interaction, in your experience, shift and change and evolve after an affair?
We do know actually, from the statistics that marriage is rapidly declining.
A lot of people don't perhaps have the choice to go separate ways after an affair.
One of the things that we don't talk about nearly enough is how extremely difficult it is to be in a very, very long-term relationship.
It's very difficult for people to feel able to be intimate or vulnerable with someone if they feel that the trust is gone. I think
there's a lot of idealisation around what it's like to be in one long relationship with one person. And of course, that includes just having sex with that one person.
Yeah, we're going to move on from this as well, and I'm not going to bring that out of my back pocket every time we have a rupture.
One of the things I talk about a lot is the difference between the phrase relationships ending and relationships failing, and ending doesn't mean failed.
I think the way that someone recovers from an affair is by gaining a very deep understanding of what led them to it.
Welcome to Sex Tells, the podcast where we normalise every aspect of sex, relationships and the parts of ourselves that we don't always say out loud. I'm your host, Lucy Frank, psychosexual and relationship therapist, and today in episode 2 we're diving into one of the most painful, complicated and often misunderstood experiences in relationships, affairs. Why they happen, what they reveal, and whether a relationship can truly recover. I'm joined by two brilliant voices in the space. First, Kate Moyle, psychosexual and relationship therapist, author and host of the Sexual Wellness Sessions podcast, and Juliet Rosenfeld, a psychoanalyst and the author of Affairs. And both will be bringing a deeply thoughtful lens to love, loss, and the complexities of human relationships. Together, we're going to unpack the emotional, relational, and intimate layers of infidelity and shed some light on what really happens on both sides of the affair. So amazing to have you both. Thank you for being here. I suppose, first of all, kind of 1 in 5 relationships at some level, have an affair on the receiving end to some impact. When sort of clients, from your perspective, use the word affair, what is it that we're actually talking about? What are we defining? Because that's multifaceted, multi-layered.
I'm going to let Juliet go first, as the title of her book is Affairs.
Yeah.
I would say that it's when a compact or an agreement between two people is broken. Mm-hmm. And the kind of affairs that I was writing about and that I'm interested in and that I think cause real damage are those affairs when the emotional trust between two people is broken.
Yeah.
And then within that, I think you're talking about a lot of different ways in which people do that.
Yes, exactly. Okay, what's your...
Yeah, I'd say trust and agreement. And, sometimes in therapy we talk about the invisible contract. So is that assumed or is it explicitly agreed? Mm-hmm. And, often people might say, oh, well, we were married, so there's an assumed set of terms that go with that, or we've been together a long time, or, for people who are monogamous, that's often an assumption. Mm-hmm. And we're now seeing there's a real change to the landscape with sexting, with online relationships, with kind of flirting with people online, where people say, well, I never had sex with anyone, but I was still in relationship with someone else or having an emotional connection with someone else. And I think this is where, particularly, I think in therapy rooms, we see people having a disagreement about actually what the rules they set might have been.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of difference between the kind of emotional and physical is a really important one, isn't it? Because it's like it wasn't really an affair because actually nothing physical happened, when actually you're really engaging in this really deep emotional connection with somebody.
Yeah, and it's where that line between, I think, trust and affair or betrayal, then where we see the kind of differences in how people understand those and the similarities as well.
Yeah.
But just to add, though, the potential for sexual betrayal using technology is also really different now.
Yeah.
And I would say there is absolutely potential for sexual betrayal without two people ever meeting.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. So I've read your book 3 times, Juliet. I love it. It's fantastic. And as a psychosexual and relationship therapist, also you've got your sort of thought process and your formulation as well at the back to some extent, which is amazing. But what led you to write it and to reach out and specifically around affairs?
Well, I mean, as you said, I think that often the third person to know about an affair is a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often in the consulting room that an affair first sort of comes to the cold light of day. Interestingly, and I write about this in the book, not before an affair happens, but when one is underway, when someone is frightened that someone's going to discover an affair, when someone wants an affair to come to light. I think sometimes affairs are a way in which someone says to their partner that relationship is over. I don't think any of us here would be apologists for affairs, but the reality is they do happen, and they happen for many, many reasons.
Yeah.
So I think this always interested me. I think affairs are interesting. I mean, one has only to look at the Coldplay couple this summer, which was extraordinary. It kept on generating news stories, and I was very interested in that, why it was.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we are all interested in affairs. I mean, whether we admit to that or not, I think we all know at some very profound, probably quite infantile level about being preferred, not being the apple of someone's eye. In some way we know, if we think about Oedipus, we know that eventually whoever our principal carer is, mom, dad, or whatever, has other things to do. We're not, as the baby, always going to be, absolutely everything. And so I think they are just very sort of much in our sort of primitive, the understanding, I suppose, about why people have affairs. I think we have some notion of what it's being like. We've all been in some way made to feel that we're not the most important person.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to have had an affair, I think, to sort of understand the pain that can cause.
Yeah, absolutely. Often we're always talking about, we recognise or we understand that one person can't meet all of our needs. And we talk about that all the time, don't we, in the therapy room. And I suppose, what is it, what is the longing, or what is it that we're not getting? What are we not receiving that means that we're reaching out? Because often it's not about the other. It's something to do with ourselves. Okay, I don't know what you think.
I love the Esther Perel quote around this, which is that kind of often people who are having an affair are looking for a different version of themselves rather than a different partner.
Yeah.
And I think that if we think about the start of something, we give our best versions and people see the best versions of us. And I think that's really attractive in, like, who doesn't like to feel their best or think that someone else thinks they're the best version? And that erodes in some way with long-term relationships, with intimacy, with life, with all of the stuff that we have to do together. And of course, it's not perfect all of the time. And we see every relationship therapist talks about this. It's Stan Tatkin talks about how we are disappointments. Terry Real talks about how the day you wake up next to your partner in bed and roll over and think, I've made a horrible mistake, is the day your marriage starts. And I think that all of this stuff is super important, because we don't have that with affairs a lot of the time, at least not at the start. And that, I think, is the appeal of it. And so often I think people, there's always a choice, there's always a decision to be made, but we can get so seduced by being seen through someone new's eyes and feeling like that version of ourselves, and thinking that someone else can see us that way when perhaps that's not how we're seen in our daily life and relationships. And that is attractive.
Yeah.
And also, I think one sort of aspect of an affair that seems often to be so clear is that, to the therapist anyway, not necessarily to the people involved, is that, whatever the reason was for the affair beginning often really predates that couple. That actually affairs are often to do, I think, with seeking repair or seeking to kind of change something, redo it. I think affairs are about an inability to mourn often.
Yeah, okay.
And what you just said is absolutely, I agree with you. I think often the most successful relationships are where both parties can really mourn the fact that people are disappointing to each other. And as you say too, affairs are, I think all relationships have a lot of fantasy in them, but affairs exponentially have fantasy in them because they're not really grounded in that sort of reality of the agreement that you've made with someone, with everything that comes with that, sort of the daily grind or quotidian or whatever the agreements that you've made, economic or with children or whatever. And affairs, of course, don't have that. So I think they are a way in which people often, much more unconsciously than consciously, they know they're seeking reparation of some sort.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I often find as well not had enough exposure to their own individualization in terms of immediately just moved into a two or more and not actually understood themselves to that extent, as well as part of it. I think the other thing is it's always about the kind of perpetrator and the victim. And we all gather round, or one gathers round the kind of the victim and understanding their really negative experience. And then there's the perpetrator and they've done this too. And actually, when I was reading your book, I had a lot of sympathy, a lot of empathy for the supposed perpetrator. I'm trying to ask fundamentally, is there a clear perpetrator and victim, or is it much, much more complicated and nuanced than that?
I'm much more interested in dynamic.
Yeah.
Clearly, sometimes there is a more obvious kind of finger to be pointed if someone has, like I said earlier, there's always a decision. There's always a point that someone decides to step over the line, and once they've stepped over it, they can't go back.
Yeah.
Whether or not their partner knows about it, for them, they've crossed something. But once, I think, and in therapy, bear in mind, particularly when we're working with couples, it's not our job to always save a relationship. It's not to keep couples together or else. We're here to work on whatever the future of this relationship might look like. And sometimes that might be, you made a nod to it earlier, that people have an affair to end a relationship. They don't know how to end it, and so that becomes a reason, or they know it's a non-negotiable, and that's what kind of comes to therapy. But I think that once we get into it, we're talking about unmet needs, we're talking about dynamics, we're talking about history, both individual and couple, and it's often sometimes a kind of death of a thousand cuts. It's lots of tiny interactions or repeated interactions or unmet needs or unmet discussions that have led to something. And also sometimes couples are in complete crisis and they don't know what to do, so they take the energy outside the relationship. And in a strange way, that can feel easier than repairing what can feel unrepairable.
Monumental. Yeah. So easier just to go through the escape hatch.
But in therapy,
and sabotage.
Yeah, but in therapy, if you want to explore it, you have to have two people who are prepared to go there. And with that much damage done, potentially, or no goodwill left, that means that sometimes couples don't want to or can't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's also sort of leads on is disclosure fundamentally helpful? And when can it cause, from your point of view or what you've seen, unnecessary harm? We're talking about truth, we're talking about honesty, we're wanting people to be vulnerable in that, but actually is there a space where that is unhelpful?
Well, I mean, I think one of the sort of virtues of psychoanalysis is it treats, and psychotherapies, that we treat everybody as an individual.
Yeah.
So I think generalizations are difficult to make. But I mean, certainly in a couple coming to therapy, if one person has had an affair and it's not over, that makes the work almost impossible. So I think there are some things that you have to be very clear about. I mean, I agree with everything that Kate is saying, and I very much agree with the sort of the terms of perpetrator and victim. They're very objectifying, and they're not helpful. And to your point, I think that one of the most important things that the person who has been, let's say, not the person having the affair, but the person whose trust has been betrayed, has to think about when an affair comes to light is, what do I want now? Do I want to be in this relationship with this person who's done this to me?
Yeah. That
it shouldn't be a given that really you want to fix it, that it's very important to be able to think about what has gone on. And of course, it's very difficult to repair a relationship after it's happened. It does take a huge amount of sort of maturity and patience, management of frustration on the part of the person who has, been betrayed, because normally the person that has done the betraying, probably understandably just really wants this sort of agonizing anger to subside and be over. But actually, one thing I would say about affairs, and I think it's rare, but I think it also does happen, that sometimes an affair can actually really change a couple's relationship. Do you agree? For the better, and that seems very paradoxical, but I think I have seen that.
I agree, and I think again there's something about, because never before have we got to such truth. Often it's the first time we're really, really talking about our needs to that degree, or this is what I was missing, or this is what I want. I don't know what your experience of that is, Kate, in your
I think the only
room.
thing about that is you have to have a couple who are able, and individuals who are able to work through and then recognise and move on without the trump card to every argument being, but you had an affair. Because it's impossible to move. And that is a huge, huge task. I mean, it sounds small when I say it like that, but it is a massive undertaking. But otherwise, and this is where I think couples can get really stuck in the aftermath of something like this, every disagreement about everything gets kind of final card on the table is, but you had an affair. And so there's nothing that can be moved past. And I think that if it is an immovable force, I would say it's almost impossible to be able to move on with a functional kind of happy relationship if that isn't possible. But that it takes a lot of, psychological work. And I would argue a lot of strength for someone to be able to say, okay, well, if I really want this, then I have to not make peace with it necessarily, but I have to be able to work with it as a part of our relationship and what happened. And it's about that having kind of becoming a part of the tapestry, without that sounding too cheesy, of what these people have been through.
So I suppose back to that, what factors do you think, make healing possible, sort of in the aftermath of affair, and what makes it, in your experience, I suppose, unlikely for that to occur as well?
Well, I think the healing, I mean, it depends whether you're talking about a couple or an individual.
Yeah.
But if I think about individuals, I think what makes it possible to sort of recover from an affair, and let's not, as you say, let's focus on the dynamics rather than who did what. But I think is probably a working through of what led to you doing something that was, normally so full of jeopardy. I mean, that's one thing about affairs that always is interesting and surprising, and I think it's why there are so many books and films and plays about them, is that they involve people who are normally pretty sensible, responsible individuals suddenly doing something that involves a lot of risk, and at risk of damage to themselves, but also to others, important others, like children as well. So I think the way that someone recovers from an affair is by gaining a very deep understanding of what led them to it.
Yeah.
And obviously, I would say, as psychoanalyst, is I'm very interested in how someone understands themselves unconsciously and biographically.
Yes.
And how it is that they, can begin to, I suppose, accommodate a kind of a narrative about their lives that makes sense. I mean, we have all these tropes and cliches, don't we, about, people sort of marrying their mothers or only going for men that look like their fathers or whatever it is. But actually, I do think that often affairs manifest because they are about these very early relationships and some sort of way in which something was not met early on. And of course, to say that consciously sounds ridiculous, but very, very often in the consulting room, when someone's been sort of deeply working, trying to figure out what's happened to them, why they got themselves into a situation that has been so damaging to them, that's where it sort of ends up. A kind of understanding seems to come often from childhood. And that's not to in any way excuse that kind of behaviour, but again, I'm not really looking, I'm very uninterested in judgment. That's not my job. I have no role in someone's life telling them right or wrong. I'm helping them, to understand what is maybe harder for them to understand about themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose to that as well, it's about the other person, as you've said, Kate, being able to quote unquote forgive to some level, or not necessarily forgive, but to be able to take accountability, I suppose, for the part that they're playing in saying, we're going to move on from this as well, and I'm not going to bring that out of my back pocket every time we have a rupture, because it's I choose to stay and you have an opportunity not to stay. But yeah, it's doing that part. I mean, obviously, from a psychosexual point of view, how does the sexual interaction, in your experience, shift and change and evolve after an affair? Once we have slept with another.
One thing you just said, going back one point, is you said the opportunity to stay on. Some people don't have the opportunity not to stay.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important point to make. Some people don't have the financial independence.
Sure.
They can't split childcare.
Yes,
they
absolutely.
can't live separately from a partner. And I think it's one thing we do have to include as a part of this conversation is a lot of people don't perhaps have the choice to go separate ways after an affair. And that doesn't mean that they have to also live kind of having repaired, but there is, and we do see this, that sometimes couples can get stuck in with one partner kind of either kind of repeatedly having affairs, but not everyone does have the option to leave or to go their separate ways. And I think that brings out a different kind of set of conversations. But, sexually, if we go to that point, it's very difficult for people to feel able to be intimate or vulnerable with someone if they feel that the trust is gone. I think, one of the things we see a lot reported is that people they're like, I can't get out of my head. I have images of them with someone else. Is the sex that they were having with someone else more exciting? What does that mean about the sex that we're having? Particularly like the world we live in now, people can see, they can visualize, they can get access to kind of partners or people that they might know through social media who the person is. They can find their LinkedIn profile. We find that level of visibility and kind of interest is really exercised by people a lot. And that brings up a whole load of anxieties about why that person might have perhaps been chosen over us, our level of attractiveness, our insecurities. Is it that, a thing we hear a lot, is it that, my body changed and that's what this is about? This is someone who, and we can see, you use the word mirror earlier, like the kind of anxieties can be mirrored to us in terms of that. But it takes a lot, and particularly sex can often be a reason cited for an affair. It can be sometimes quite easily reached as well. We haven't had sex for ages. Like, what did you think was going to happen? And I think that it can be quite a kind of top shelf grab.
Yeah, totally.
For affairs. And it's very difficult for people to repair that because we have this kind of ongoing narrative in our heads about what it means, not about just our relationship, not about our partners, but about us. And we see that there does need to be kind of quite a lot of repair work done in terms of that. But also the fear is if we don't, and the reason that we have cited is that it's about sex, if we don't fix, inverted commas, the sex, then this is going to happen again, or then nothing's changed. And that's quite a big mountain for people to get over.
Yeah. A really big mountain, I suppose also I've seen on the flip side of it, it's really, again, it's opened up those honest conversations about people's wants and needs and where they're placed. And actually then there's also the possibility that there can be an evolution of, and that actually intimacy becomes something that becomes a more positive experience. And that's because also it opens up the conversation for both people, not just one of them.
Although I think resentment plays a really interesting part there, because I think sex from a place of resentment is not what I would argue is good sex. And if someone feels incredibly resentful about the fact that they are having sex to repair a relationship, I would argue from a therapist position that that's only going to cause more potential rupture, more potential damage, even if that person is holding on to that resentment individually and not expressing it. So like, okay, this is what I have to do to keep this, and I don't want to do it,
Yes.
I would argue that is not going to help anyone.
Yeah. I know that I've spoken to you about this, Juliet, just about affairs in general and kind of how this fits in with monogamy, right? And like whether or not monogamy is actually in crisis. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, one of the things that we don't talk about nearly enough is how extremely difficult it is to be in a very, very long-term relationship.
Yeah.
And we do know, actually, from the statistics, that marriage is rapidly declining. We now have the lowest rate of childbirth that we've ever had.
Yeah.
And this really all comes from women making very different choices. So my work at UCL is really about this, is about why it is that women are, I think, driving the choice not to be in a one long-term monogamous relationship with a man. This sort of coined hetero-pessimism that Asa Sorensen wrote about, this sort of idea that, having a boyfriend or men are very disappointing. I mean, I'm not sure I do think that, actually, but I think that, yes, it is very trying and difficult to be in a long-term relationship. And I think that, psychotherapists talk about that quite a lot, but that still there's a lot of idealization around what it's like to be in one long relationship with one person. And of course, that includes just having sex with that one person.
Yeah.
The more that is thought about and talked about, the better.
We still kind of consider relationships to be successful based on longevity.
Yeah.
So longevity is one of the most normalized measures of relationship success in society. And one of the things I talk about a lot is the difference between the phrase relationships ending and relationships failing. And ending doesn't mean failed.
Yes.
But we use them synonymously. And that's really problematic, I think, because sometimes people grow apart. They're like, we want something different. For the different part of our lives, we're seeing a real peak in retirement divorces at the moment because people are suddenly back together and they're like, and they don't know how to be together, and they're like, oh, I don't want this actually for my next years. And I think it's really important that we kind of talk about that, because we do measure it by these kind of traditional relationship escalator success steps, which is that people kind of are together for a while, they get engaged, they get married, they have children, they get all together, and it's kind of a tick box process. And the thing we talk about the escalator is that people get on and often they don't kind of consciously address that kind of the going up, the kind of going through the stages.
Well, also what, the ONS or the census doesn't address is actually how many people are in deeply unhappy marriages and relationships who never separate and who never divorce. And I fully take on board, and I think you're absolutely right to remind us all of it, that some people don't have the choice to separate. But at the same time, you're not and you should not be imprisoned in a relationship.
No.
And if that means that space has to be shared while separately, living, well, that sometimes happens too. But you're not imprisoned in your relationship. And our grandmothers had different kinds of choices to the ones that we had, and our great-grandmothers. And so I think that there really is a change happening now in the relationship landscape. I mean, 20 years ago, 1 in 4 of us was married. Now it's 1 in 7. I mean, that's extraordinary. 20 years.
Yeah.
So we have to take notice of it and understand why it's happening and what it's to do with.
Yeah, exactly, and loads of data about the fact that
There's lots of data
that and the happiest people are single
lots
women
of people
over
choosing
50,
to live alone.
as well, and are doing away with that.
And definitions of commitment. I think, marriage was considered the ultimate commitment. Now we have a change in the financial status of our cultures, in buying property together, and the differences in that, in needing 2 kind of salaried working households. I think there's all of these factors. It all plays
I agree.
a change.
Yeah.
Plays a part in kind of changing how people do things, the decisions people make, what they can make. And I think it's, of course that's going to shift the landscape in a big way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of on the kind of ethical non-monogamy side as well, I suppose, what do we think about people coming with an ethical non-monogamous contract or framework after the event of an affair? Like, actually, maybe we need to move forward like this, moving forward. What do we think about that?
Well, I mean, I certainly know. So I work in a big practice in London, and certainly my couple and individual colleagues would all say that there is something changing. For example, couples coming and saying, we would like to discuss an open marriage, ethical non-monogamy. Now, what that means is obviously completely individual and down to the couple. And I also think it's complicated. I think it's really complicated. It is very difficult to kind of audit and legislate one's feelings, you know, with another person. It's all very well to just say, well, it's, you know, going to be either this or that and, you know, no emotion involved or whatever. But actually, really, it's very difficult to do that. But that said, I think there is this change that we're agreeing is afoot, so that it's not sort of a niche thing, that people are genuinely beginning to kind of come and wonder with the psychotherapist about why it is that they're not happy in the relationship that they're in. And sometimes, I mean, couples coming together to wonder about that.
Yeah, I'd say first point is an affair is very different to consent. We use the word consensual non-monogamy because it's consensual. It's with the agreement of everyone involved. And so there's a difference between people kind of saying, okay, we want to explore non-monogamy consensually, ethically, and I had an affair. Those are two, or someone had an affair.
Absolutely,
those are two separate
very different
entities.
things.
And whilst one might be a kind of gateway, perhaps, into exploring the other, they are distinct. And I think that some of the kind of conversations that happen generally liken the two. And, you know, what we also see is a lot of people saying, particularly on apps and things like that, oh, my partner knows about this, but actually people might find out later that the partner doesn't know. And so that's, again, we see different kind of sets of behaviours and agreements. But I love the relationship therapist Nikki D's kind of multi-step model of exploring this. And I think it's 6. I think it's 7, actually. And it's fascinating because the way that she works with it is she gets couples to explore down to the kind of minutiae of what would this be like. And so one of the examples she gave is your partner hasn't had an orgasm with you for 2 years, and you invite a third and you're having a sexual experience and you see them having an amazing orgasm with the other person. What goes on for you in that moment? And I really like how she sets up that multi-stage kind of exploration model with couples, because it takes them through that. And this kind of conversation around jealousy doesn't happen in non-monogamy. That's not the case.
No, absolutely.
It's just that actually people talk about it differently. They communicate about it differently. They explore it differently. They have agreements for it. It's not a blank slate. We don't have any of these feelings.
But don't you think also that the likening, as you put it, of the two is also because it is blurry and complicated?
Yeah, absolutely.
It is very difficult to kind of set out one set of rules, as I say, because it's very difficult to kind of think of feelings like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'd say people in non-monogamous relationships say they're constantly negotiating and checking and talking and exploring and checking. And I would say it's a bit like the assumption that it's just one kind of conversation and it's done. And I would say, no, I don't know anyone who's in a non-monogamous relationship who would say that's the case.
Absolutely. And I think I sort of working with people in non-monogamous relationships and polydynamics, it's, as you've said, Kate, like, you know, it's more complex, it's constant conversation. I mean, I've often thought sometimes, you know, actually there's so much conversation about the relationship that that in itself almost becomes slightly addictive, you know, that actually we're not just being anymore, that our whole relationship is the dynamic and the contract and the working out of, just to some extent. But yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. I suppose, you know, in either of your experience, if somebody discovers that their partner is having an affair, what would your advice be?
Well, the first thing, I've said it already, is ask yourself what you want.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. What do you really want? And that may also be a conversation that someone has not really wanted to have, and that someone else's behaviour is what provokes someone into coming to see a therapist, because the affair, as it were, has exposed, you know, clearly problems in the relationship. So that's my first thought, really, is ask yourself what you really, really want. And as I said earlier, you know, it's very individual.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any kind of rule at all. I just think that if somebody is able to come and think about that once they've discovered an affair. That's very important.
Yeah. Is there any kind of red flags? Is there any prerequisite of behaviour or an understanding that people, when they're getting into a relationship, I suppose, is there anything that we should be looking out for? And again, that's a big, that's a big question.
I'd love to know your take on this.
I think about the capacity to trust one's instinct and to trust one's gut instinct. And that relationships, they're very exciting at the beginning and they have this sort of very addictive quality. And I was thinking about Anne Power, the couples therapist who writes about sort of drug-like intoxication of falling in love. And of course, Freud wrote about this too. And Freud said famously he wouldn't treat patients who are in love because they're just impossible, they're impossible to work with. And when people are in love, they absolutely do believe that this is like nothing else that's ever happened, that this was meant to happen, all the cliches that we know about. But I suppose there's something about love maturing into something else and getting to know yourself as you mature and being able to sort of trust that someone is going to treat you in the way that you want to be treated, which of course can mean many, many different things, can't it? But I mean, I've got loads of examples in my head of sort of clinical situations where people didn't feel or trust that the person they were with had their interests kind of at heart. And then it's very difficult to know what to do. But psychotherapy is obviously, often there because a relationship of many different sorts is breaking down. I mean, I often think that's what all the work is about sort of at some level is about a broken down relationship.
Yeah. And I think, the things that we talk about with trust, transparency and consistency are really big. And there are sometimes cases, I think, where people are in relationships and it might be discovered that their partner's had an affair and their friends and family kind of all go, we all saw that coming, or they're like, no one's surprised. And I think sometimes the questions can be, okay, what's going on there? And what is it about? And it tends to be about trust, doesn't it? In whatever shape or form that's in. And I think that are there those things that make you feel uneasy or make you feel that this person kind of can't be trusted or that bring up that stuff for you? And on the flip side, there are also the cases, you mentioned it earlier, where people I never saw that coming. And it's a kind of difficult thing to describe, but we all know those people in our lives. We all know the people that we have those kind of feelings about.
Yeah, I use the word gut instinct, but I think that gut is trust, isn't it? And of course, the thing about the couple is the central important link between two people is trust.
Yeah.
Kind of a lot of other things, can be there or not be there. But trust is the thing.
Yes. Yeah. And if you sense that that's not there, then that's maybe something to look at and have a deeper dive on. Totally. And as you've said, to look onto yourself a little more as well about how you're feeling about that and not push that away to some extent.
I think that lots of things can go completely and utterly wrong in relationships and can change dramatically. Like having children is the perfect example of relationship disruption, kind of 101. But if you trust your partner, you also kind of trust that you'll get through it, even if it gets really bad. You have that there is the kind of undercurrent or perhaps the foundation. And of course, trust can get ruptured by various things. But I think if it feels like it's there and it's solid, you also trust you'll come out the other side of it.
Yeah.
And the potential to kind of get through it is there. But it's when all of that feels kind of shaky to the point of untrustworthy, I guess the kind of flip side of it, that's when we start to feel differently.
Yes.
But it's quite an intangible thing to describe.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were talking about it, it's difficult, isn't it? But I was thinking also, though, that the betrayal of sexual trust, which is, the agreement between two people that their bodies are, engaged in this very particular relationship that you don't necessarily have with anybody else. It's such a clear way, isn't it, of denoting that trust is broken, which is why affairs are so devastating.
Yeah.
And the impact can be, I think, can sort of reach into decades, actually, when it comes to families, because a child's trust, the belief that, two parents are together, that is ruptured at that point too. And this is something that I think we often don't think about enough. That I often think I've seen patients who decades later, their own sort of psychosexual emotional lives were sort of spoiled by their parents' behaviour, the trust that they had about their parents would be together and safety. And so I think there are so many impacts of an affair, actually.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you both all day long about it, but maybe if we finish on the trust aspect, because I think fundamentally that's what we're talking about here, a breaking of trust and a feeling of trust, and whether or not we can repair that trust moving forward. But thank you both so much. It's been brilliant talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.